You are not an exporting country. You import everything, including toothpick. Why do you devalue your currency? The elite, when they want to steal, they don't have ethnicity, they don't have religion. They just steal. When you look at the World Bank and the IMF, the structure of voting there, who vote there, who decide what there, who decide which policy there, you realize that the logic for the establishment is not about Africa, because we're not even at the table when those conferences were held in the Bretton Woods. The structural adjustment program, the lending conditionality that are imposed on Africa, that tells you that these are not institutions that can get Africa to develop.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Unpopular Opinion podcast. Many Africans believe that Africa is truly free, but the question is who's actually pulling the strings when it comes to issues that are happening across the African continent? While the world praises globalization and its shady deals, many African countries' economies are still shaped by decisions made in Brussels, Berlin, Beijing, and Washington. Has Pan-Africanism become a nostalgic dream, or can it still be used as a weapon to destroy or to dismantle economic structural dependency? Are the World Bank and the IMF financial gatekeepers, or are they friends to African countries? Is the African continental free trade area truly for the African people, or is it just another stage for the African elites to do more corruption? Joining us to discuss all of this is one of Africa's sharpest mind, Professor Samuel Oja Olarutumba. We are going to be asking some significant questions regarding African politics, development, and independence across the African continent. If you think you know more about African politics, stay tuned, because this conversation might simply challenge many things you think you know about African development. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It is indeed an exciting opportunity for us to have you. I want us to start with this. Is Pan-Africanism still relevant today? And do you think has it become more of an academic ideal than political reality for the African continent?
Thank you very much for having me, Mohammed. This is a very exciting project. And to your question straight, Pan-Africanism remains very relevant because, as I've written in several, papers and books, William Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. You recall that at the inception, Pan-Africanism was about reaffirming the humanity of Africans in the diaspora, especially in the US. And it dovetailed to the decolonization movement in Africa, and it really contributed to the decolonization of several countries in Africa, the last being South Africa, which got independence, from the settler colonies in 1994. So Pan-Africanism remains relevant today despite the challenges of operationalization, because the global capitalist system in which Africa operate in a way that perpetuate the unequal international division of labor. And like Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his book 1963, except Africa unite, they will perish. So Pan-Africanism remains relevant, especially when you talk about, negotiating trade relationship, investment relationship between Africa and the other part of the world. Call it China, call it America, call it Britain, or anywhere. So to me, it's not just a slogan, it is a theory. I've just finished writing a paper that argued that Pan-Africanism is a theory of international relations. And I mentioned it in the class yesterday, that it contributed to reshaping, the global order in ways that allow for the freedom of expression of previously colonized people. So it remains relevant, in short.
I want us to look at another aspect of this discussion that has to do with the African Union. Do you think has the African Union failed to deliver true unity for the African continent? Or are we expecting more from an organization that many people argued is suffering from sovereignty politics?
Good question. The African Union, from its inception, from the Organization for African Unity, which was formed in 1963. Um, the organization has played a very important role, especially again in political decolonization of Africa, but it is falling under its own contradiction. Contradiction because even from its foundation, you will realize that three main groups emerge: the Casablanca group, the Brazzaville group, and the Morovia group. Morovia grew, which prefer a kind of a gradual integration of Africa, whereas the Casablanca group prefer a radical integration of Africa with Nkrumah at the head. So that foundational problem remains today because the idea of a United States of Africa still remains in limbo because many African leaders still don't see the need for it because they thrive in dividing us. The colonialists divide us so that they can rule us, divide and rule, and then the post-colonial elite also do that because they see the opportunity of exploiting religious fault lines, ethnic, tribal fault line to maintain power. Look, the elite, when they want to steal, they don't have ethnicity. They don't have religion. They just steal. But when it comes to voting, they see. So that play out in how the African Union operate. It is not a supranational organization. It lacks enforcement mechanism. I'm doing a project with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa on African Policy Implementation Lab. We realized that more than 40 treaties and protocols that have been adopted at the African Union, they are never implemented. Signed, agreed upon, but because the countries, the states, they love the bondage of colonial boundary, they continue to just operate in silos. Talk about the free movement of people, for instance. Only three countries, as far as I know, have signed to that protocol because of the fear that all African countries will come and, you know, swamp to South Africa or to any other developed countries in Africa. So the African Union it has its own internal contradiction that have limited how to deliver on its mandate to foster unity in Africa. Yet, without that unity, we will continue to be at the mercy of the rapacious, uh, you know, different groups in the world who just see Africa as a site for mineral exploitation and market for their products.
Thank you so much. I like the way you ended this part of your answer because that's something that I wanted to come up to right now. You spoke about politics. The politicians or the elites do not see religion, they do not see tribes, they don't see ethnicity, but they see corruption, they see stealing as a means to keep themselves in power. But when it comes to votes, they will always come down to to the ordinary people and start to divide us based upon religion, based upon ethnicities. And I want us to look at another aspect which has to do with financial aspect of the continent. Do you think international backed institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF are deliberately keeping the African countries or the African continent dependent upon them? And what do you think that countries in Africa need to do at this critical period of modernity to be able to have some balance within our economic or within our financial institutions?
Another good question. Um, to respond to that question, I will take us back to how this world order was put in place. It was put in place by the most powerful group that emerged after the Industrial Revolution in Europe, where they developed weapons, guns, which they were able to translate into what we call the paradigm of war, and then use that as a means of, enslavement, imperialism, the colonialism, the various expeditions they carried out to destroy the existing kingdoms and, and the powers in Africa. And so that dovetailed, the contradiction within the Western society themselves. You have what they call the First World War, which is actually European war, the Second World War, which was also European war. And so you see that, and in post 1945, the Bretton Woods institutions were established, with the International Bank for Reconstruction. According to Joseph Stiglitz, in his book Globalization and its Discontent, it was actually International Bank for Reconstruction of Europe. He said in that book that and development was an afterthought. And later it was changed to the World Bank. But when you look at the World Bank and the IMF, the structure of voting there, who vote there, who decide what there, who decide which policy there, you realize that the logic for the establishment it's not about Africa because we're not even at the table when those conferences were held in the Bretton Woods that led to the establishment. So the logic of operation is still part of what I call coloniality, coloniality of power, where colonialism is about civilizing Africa. It's about commercialization and then Christianization. So they've evolved. All of these systems they've evolved, but the the motive force, the foundational logic is still the same. And 3 years ago, a professor, a Nigeria-born professor in Cornell University, came to give a lecture here at Ottawa University of Ottawa, and then he wrote this book that he called Against Decolonization. And when he was making that presentation, people around were asking, "What's your brother saying? What's your brother saying?" And I went to meet him. He's an old man. I said, respectfully, "Sir, what are you saying with this book? Are you telling me that the way the IMF relate with Europe is the same way they relate with Africa?" And then he said, "I don't care about that." Right? So your question is very pertinent. Even though they said they are fostering development, and I work as a consultant to the World Bank for some time, you know, they've done a couple of things about project financing and all of that. But in terms of policy, when you look at the Washington Consensus, which was, by John Williamson in 1990, all of these policies, the way they play out in Africa, the structural adjustment program, the lending conditionality that are imposed on Africa, that tells you that these are not institutions that can get Africa to develop. And I was very happy that in 2015, the IMF said that the structural adjustment program was a mistake. It was hurriedly implemented, and that led to a lot of negative multiplier effect. In fact, it led to the lost decade of the 1980s, according to Adebayo Adedeji. So in 2018, the then World Bank president also admitted that some of their policies have not really helped to foster development in Africa. In the issue of trade liberalization, for instance, the issue of liberalization of capital accounts. I'm sure you are familiar with those. Removal of capital control. And all of that, which I've written extensively about. They they're just indication of the fact that, you know, they are bobbing your head in your absence. Joseph Stiglitz called it one size fits all policies without looking at the peculiar condition, the condition of the countries. So that is that. But to conclude this section, my point has always been, as a political scientist, the world is defined by interest is called in international relation, we call it realist theory of international relation. It's the survival of the fittest. Powerful states use their power to get what they want. So it is left for African countries to think developmentally and think in the interest of their own countries and formulate policies, which is why the first question on Pan-Africanism matter. Because no country in Africa alone can withstand these institutions. They come with a lot of pressure. They come with a lot of, suggestion. Look at Nigeria, my country of birth, for instance. The IMF have been saying forever that the currency is overvalued. The currency is overvalued. And now the new president listened to them and devalued the currency. And that has created a lot of poverty for the citizens. You can devalue your currency if you are an exporting country, But if you are not an exporting country, you import everything, including toothpick. Why do you devalue your currency? So, the challenge is on us as Africans to think about it, to understand the global capitalist system, the logic of it, the people who benefit from it, and to foreground our own interests
All
and the interests of our.
All right. Thank you so much. You just answered the next question that I wanted to ask. I mean, this conversation really, really interesting, and I think the viewers will appreciate, or I appreciate in this video. I want to ask you about the African Continental Free Trade Area. Do you think the African Continental Free Trade Area is a revolutionary step that the African Union has taken, which belongs to the African people, or do you think it's a step that allows the African elite to be able to carry out more corruption at the detriment of the people?
Fundamentally, an integrated Africa is a good thing. And that has been part of the recommendations of, the founding fathers of Africa since inception, from the Lagos Plan of Action for the Final Act of Lagos 1980, 1981. The idea of integration has been on the agenda. Abuja Treaty of 1991, the NEPAD and all of that. So integration, we trade the least among the major regions in the world at about 16% or 17% now, compared to EU or North America or Latin America. So Asia, we trade the least, and it's important to trade more. But you know, I was in Kigali. I organized a roundtable in Kigali in 2018, and as I was talking about, free trade, after I just came, an illumination just came to my mind that, look, okay, is it because you got dollar from the United Nations? That's why you are not talking about free trade. And then I laughed to myself because free trade, as it is, has never led any country to development. When all you do is free trade and you just liberalize everything, is a death sentence, as it were. Free trade only work when you have something to produce, when you have something to manufacture. So, to the extent that, yes, I did a special issue of a journal on this, after structural transformation. If we live to the tenet of the agreement, indeed, it can lead to development in Africa. If we need to manufacture, manufacturing of products from within the regions in Africa, it can increase global, regional value shares, global value shares. It can. But are the conditions there to do that? That's the main question. Do we have the skill set to produce? Do we have the machinery? Do we have the financial outlay, the capital outlay to produce, to manufacture? Yes, services sectors, we can see a lot of changes there. So your question is very pertinent, because not just that whether the elite want to use it to enrich themselves, but whether we're actually playing the card of other regions of the world, especially the European Union. European Union don't like me to talk about it. I wrote my PhD thesis on European Union, by the way, so EU-African relations. So, because, and I'm reviewing a paper for a journal now, and the person was writing so what I would have written about the fact that African countries, they've signed into AFTA, but they also have the right within the AFTA to have third party agreement, to have agreement with third countries that are not members of the AFTA. For instance, the EPA. Countries have signed into EPA. So EU or China or US can actually come in within this EPA, AFTA regime, to flood our market with their products. And because these countries, they have a better advantage in terms of access to cheaper costs of fund and, skill set, they will produce cheaper than any African company that want to produce the same product. And that was what happened when we signed into the WTO in 1994 at the end of the Uruguay round. that we signed into WTO, the textile industries in most African countries, they are dead because of, flooding, dumping of products. So I am for all the integration of African economy, but it has to be done with careful art. It has to be done with capacity building for industrialization.
As you were talking about African countries trading among themselves, when I was writing my thesis on the, the youth development and how can young people be able to participate in economic development across the African continent, I realized that just ECOWAS between 1995 up to 2015, we only like our total trade percent with one another is just 14%. SADC is almost about 15%, and then you have the East African community is also about 12 point something percent. That is out of 100% in last 15 years. So that tells you how low and how poor we are when it comes to trading with one another. And I just want to clarify, add on to what you said and also continue with my questioning that has to do with trade negotiation. This has been another challenging issue when it comes to African countries
Eh,
coming
Can
to.
I stop? Can
Okay.
I stop you before? So because I did a paper which I presented at the CAS conference in June.
Okay.
It's about informality. The question of the percentage of trade between African countries just focus on the formal sector. When you look at what they call informal sector, the trade volume, the percentage is much higher. And that's where the problem is. So if you go to our website, there's a policy brief on the language of informality. Informality. So we need to begin to think of how we describe our economic activities. So because when we follow the Eurocentric idea of a formal economy, we undercut ourselves. What happened between Lagos and there's a place called Okearing in Lagos, where people from Togo, from Benin, from everywhere bring their product in a day. It's in billions. But these are not captured in official statistics because it is informal economy. The people who cross the border to buy things from other parts of the countries, they are not captured. So maybe that's a topic for another day.
I think that's a topic for another day. And like I was saying, my next question was about trade negotiation or international negotiation when it comes to African countries coming together to be at the international stage to be able to negotiate on behalf of Africa. Do you think that is possible, especially considering internal rivalries as well as political or power imbalances within many African countries?
Very important question, of which I've also written about. That except we negotiate together as a group, we will continue to be exploited by other parts of the world. Like I said, my PhD thesis was on EU-African relation in terms of the economic partnership agreement. I actually published a book on that, which is available online. You want to Liberia, for instance, you want to negotiate with European Union. Your negotiators, they don't even have money to travel for that negotiation. The EU pays them to come and negotiate with them. Remember, he who paid the piper, he takes the tune. Right?
Yes.
Benin Republic, Lesotho, Swaziland, or Eswatini, they call them now, they want to negotiate with China. Where do they have the capacity to negotiate with this? You are negotiating with somebody funding your budget, building airport for you, building roads for you. How do you negotiate? That is why the African Union is very critical. And I wrote a chapter on this in a book that we just published last year. That for EU and Africa, the AU should coordinate the negotiation on trade and investment if we really mean development. But to your question, is the current structure of what I call fake sovereignty that we are parading as African countries will not make it happen because we have not seen ourselves as one. We define ourselves based on the way the colonizer define us, right? As you are now, as from Liberia, I'm Nigerian. I don't think you want to know if I employ you in my company or I trade with you. I don't think they will put Liberia on your head or they put Nigeria on my head. No, but we have psychological boundary. We have mental boundary that flow from the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 that continue to keep us. Von Bismarck, he called that conference for a purpose, and they did it. And the purpose is for us to be weakened, right? So it appealed to the selfish nature of everybody. Where Kwame Nkrumah called the All African Congress in Ghana in 1958, I think, they said people were so afraid that it was going to declare the United States of Africa immediately. And when it didn't succeed, they said, at least I'm still going back home as a president. President of what? Of a depth-reading nation. President of a country that cannot even boast of a military defense mechanism. So the current rivalry, the current mental boundary will not allow that thing to happen, unfortunately. But that's why our project on indigenous knowledge, getting the civil society involved, getting the youth to understand that, look, this political structure that we inherited were not put in place for us. It was not put in place for our own development.